Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping national security and defense. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. In today's episode, we'll be diving into the legacy of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's leadership with a special focus on his approach to defense and security policy. We're joined by a distinguished panel of experts, including Gord Venner, Dr. Kim Nossal, Kerry Buck, and Xavier Delgado. They'll discuss the successes and challenges of Trudeau's time in office, from managing international relations to addressing Canada's evolving security needs. We'll also explore what lies ahead for Canada's defense strategy as we navigate an increasingly complex global security environment. So stay tuned for an insightful conversation, and I hope you enjoy.
Good day. My name is Gordon Venner, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of the Conference of Defense Associations Institutes, which is the Ottawa-based think tank which focuses on defense and security issues. As we record this, it has actually only been a few days since the announcement by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of his intention to resign as Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party. Now, we are striking while the iron is hot here, but we did want to have an early discussion about the legacy of Prime Minister Trudeau's tenure in the fields of defense and security, and time permitting, a discussion of what that legacy means for the road ahead. So today we will try and divide this podcast into two rounds. In the first, I will ask each of you to address the legacy, the accomplishments, the failures of the last 9+ years of the government. And then in the second round, perhaps I could ask you about the road ahead in light of your collective assessment of Prime Minister Trudeau's 3 mandates. Dr. Nossal, Kim, perhaps we could start with you, and then I would call on Ambassador Buck and Xavier in that order. So over to you. How did the Trudeau governments do?
Thanks very much, Gordon, and it's a great pleasure to be here on such a timely assessment of Mr. Trudeau's 10 years in office. I think that the legacy, to the extent that there will be one, is going to be mixed. I think that where I would begin with are the accomplishments. And one of the things I think that Mr. Trudeau will be remembered for is his government's relative success, in my humble estimation, in dealing with the first Trump administration. My own sense is that Mr. Trudeau took what was a most challenging set of problems facing the Canadian government in early 2017, and the way in which he organized a Canadian response, the so-called all hands on deck response, a kind of all of Canada response, was at the time, it seems to me, a most appropriate and eventually, I think, fairly effective way to engage an unusual administration. Needless to say, I think that the longer that Mr. Trudeau and the Trump administration engaged with one another, the less effective it became. And my own view is that this had actually nothing to do with Mr. Trudeau himself or his government, but rather the reality that, and one can get this from simply looking at how other governments managed to deal with the Trump administration, that there was a kind of a limit to how far one could get on with an administration that had a decidedly negative attitude and view towards friends and allies. And in that sense, it seems to me by the time that the last part of Mr. Trump's first administration rolled around, that there was no real saving in the way that we can see. I think that, however, on the question of national defense, and national security, that history is not going to be kind to Mr. Trudeau. I think that one of the things that will be remembered is essentially that that the government was relatively slow to adapt to a huge change, it seems to me, in the global geostrategic situation. Eventually, the Canadian government came around. But it took an awful long time to do so. I mean, if one looks at the possibility of the changes that occurred in 2021 and then in 2022, in particular, the embrace of the sort of the Indo-Pacific, the embrace of a more geostrategic approach, I think that would be very late relative to others in the global environment. There are other failings, of course. I think that Mr. Trudeau's trip to China and the failure of Canada's efforts to convince the Chinese of the appropriateness of Mr. Trudeau's more progressive approach will be one. The failure of the Canadian government to respond positively to efforts to move on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then, of course, the visit to India, which I think will stand out as a key example of, in a sense, where Mr. Trudeau went wrong. And so I think that when we look back at the 10 years, what we're going to see is essentially a rather mixed legacy. That would be my view.
Thank you, Kim, for that. Um, I find that very interesting. It's very timely to be reminded that there was some success during the first Trump administration dealing with the Trump administration, and while that was across the board and dealt with economic issues, it did have important defense and security element. You're obviously right to note that embrace of the Indo-Pacific did happen later, but better late than never, perhaps. And then the failure in the relationship with China, the visit to India, strike me as more foreign policy failures necessarily than defense and security failures. But obviously, when we consider issues like foreign interference, then those become very much part of the security agenda. So that's a very good grab bag of issues to get us started. Kerry, let me turn to you and ask you, what did you think were the highlights and the lowlights?
Well, I think in terms of the core tenets of Canadian foreign policy, that Prime Minister Trudeau continued along a path of Canadian foreign policy that his predecessors had followed. There weren't huge shifts, but there was certainly a shift in tone from his immediate predecessor and a few areas of focus that were distinguished from Prime Minister Harper. Multilateralism, refocusing on multilateralism, and at NATO, for instance, reinvesting in NATO after a few years of cuts on some areas of Canada's contributions to NATO. The chief among them, and I put this as an important initiative that Prime Minister Trudeau can take credit for, is the command of our forward presence in Latvia, taking command when NATO really needed it. From Canada, there wasn't another European nation ready to step up. And as Jens Stoltenberg said to me, he could not overstate how important what we did was for NATO and for Canada. So reinvesting in multilateralism, refocusing there, reinvesting in NATO. On defense, I agree with Dr. Nossal that the defense policy and then its updates, strong, secure, engaged, and Our North Strong and Free, they were fine pieces of work. And I think they're very helpful blueprints. to guide what was the most substantial commitment of increases in defense spending that we'd seen in decades. And I think that Prime Minister Trudeau doesn't get enough credit for those decisions, to be frank. I think where he fell down is on areas where he was kneecapped either by changes in the international environment, and chief among them, I'd say the election of Donald Trump very early in Prime Minister Trudeau's mandate, but also a world that was shifting in a way where there's a lot less room for countries like Canada to put on the table initiatives, security initiatives. We did our part over, Canada did its part under, the mandate of Prime Minister Trudeau on initiatives, around the LC initiative, for instance, more on women, peace, and security, release of our third national action plan stuff. But those aren't big ticket items that really build a lot of your credibility. It's more like Canada keeping on its issues, a little bit more on gender than predecessor. But as I said, mostly continuity in our foreign policy content. But the challenge was a few areas where I think where he did less well is he got in some what I'll call diplomatic trouble, where defter diplomacy might perhaps have avoided some of the damage to Canada's credibility, reputation, and to our particularly our bilateral relations with countries like China and India, Saudi Arabia. Um, but also with some of our closer allies as well, where we, Canada, would make a commitment and then fail to follow up in a timely fashion. So there were a few hits to our credibility. Overall, will history be kind to Trudeau? I think actually it will, but you'd have to wait a good decade, I think, because of the polarization of our current domestic political debate. I know I sat at the table with Prime Minister Trudeau early in his mandate before Trump was president, and then at summits kind of midway through his mandate. And I have to say that he actually was very good at those multilateral tables, so smaller tables, plurilateral tables, where he needed to sway other countries to Canada's view, and he was very good at that. And I can imagine that as he became the elder statesman towards the end of his mandate, that even grew even more. But the challenge was, as I said, we promised some stuff. We promised we'd do something in Mali, and that it took us a year to decide to send a plane. So we didn't deliver enough on some of those things that we promised allies we'd do, and it started to hit us.
I just wanted to go back to how you opened there because, 10 years on, it's sometimes a little hard to remember where we were at the end of the Harper administration's years. And certainly you're right to remind us that during those years, there was an overall skepticism with respect to multilateral organizations and multilateral commitments, and that NATO was not exempt from that skepticism. The broad embrace of multilateralism that we've seen under the Trudeau administration did incorporate our multilateral obligations with respect to defense. So that was good. You also just made me wonder a little bit with your comments there about our relationships with other allies. You didn't specifically run through the Five Eyes partners, but maybe that's something in the second round you might want to dive into a little bit, because I'd be very curious to know on the basis of the last 9 or 10 years, what is our role going forward, and what kind of ambition should we have in the context of the Five Eyes relationships. But sticking for the moment with the backward look, Xavier, you've heard these two expert opinions. Do you have views of your own on how we should interpret the last decade?
No, I do, and I think I bring a bit of a different background to this. Obviously, the professor emeritus and Ambassador Buck bring immense experience and knowledge to the file. I take a bit of a different approach. I was 15 years old when Prime Minister Trudeau won his first mandate. For a lot of people in my generation who are now old enough to better understand the world and Canada's place in it, there really wasn't a time before Prime Minister Trudeau's premiership where we really understood how Canada fits into this global picture of security. So all we have to build off of is how Canada has evolved since 2015 to 2025, and that's the conception for a lot of people in Gen Z like myself. So where were we in 2015 when he won his first mandate? The biggest threat, I think the consensus would be, was violent extremism. The year before, we'd had the horrible shooting on Parliament Hill, and the nature of threats to Canada were markedly different than even they were 5, 6 years ago. Of course, this is all pre-Russian invasion of Ukraine, pre-global COVID-19 pandemic. And so that's the security paradigm that Justin Trudeau came into power into. And to Ambassador Buck's comments, I agree. I think what we saw was mainly a policy of continuity in a time when people in Canada were skeptical of institutions, skeptical of NATO. There were questions about whether it was really the right institution to be fighting this trend of global extremism, where social media communities, online discourse, digital forums were radicalizing people across borders beyond the want of traditional institutions. I think even just looking to the past 4 years, though, because I think these are some of the most going to be the most formative for how people come to view Justin Trudeau's legacy, at least here in Washington, where I've lived and studied for the past 8 years. Um, a lot of how the United States sees Justin Trudeau and Canada by extension is through the transformation of looking at a Canada that won't, a Canada that won't spend 2% on defense, a Canada that has a difficult time living up to the commitments that it makes in international fora, towards a Canada that can't. And I think this is a troubling trend for Canada that's going to outlast Justin Trudeau and Ambassador Venner. I know we'll talk about this in the next segment, so I'll try not to preempt myself. But even looking in recent years, the United States' hope under the Biden administration that Canada would come to the rescue of Haiti, when instead a Kenyan task force, I believe, is the one that came in and helped at least address this security situation in that country. Canada, to its credit, moved in lockstep with the NATO allies in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think that did a lot for Canadian credibility and continues to, especially as we look to the future on whether the United States will be able to live up to its security commitments to Ukraine. Uh, Professor Nossal noted that Trudeau had some missteps on India and China, and you noted as well that there are real security implications for that when we look at foreign interference issues over the past 4 years, China in our elections, India with the alleged assassination of Sikh activists in Canada. So Justin Trudeau inherited this world in which the security paradigm was mainly violent extremism, international terrorism, and it quickly evolved into these complex issues of great power competition in the 21st century that perhaps were too difficult for Canada to navigate deftly, to navigate quickly, especially when it comes to loosening up the budgets that we can spend 2% on defense, which we know is going to be a major issue for the incoming US administration. But also, just in the grand scheme of things, it's difficult for Canada to compete with great powers, especially when it comes down to hard security issues. And I think as we move towards this new world where these are the leading security issues, Canada may have a hard time keeping up. And I think it's up for debate as to whether that's Justin Trudeau's fault or not. It may just be a consequence of a changing world that evolved under Canada's feet.
Well, thank you very much. So, Xavier, I think you've helpfully provided a bit of a segue to our second session. And I think you were also the only one who really reminded us of some of the very real problems in the geostrategic environment, which have, of course, erupted during the Prime Minister's mandate. The situation in Ukraine. We can also add, the South China Sea, Taiwan, and I don't think anyone yet has mentioned the real challenge in the Middle East, which has certainly been at least a huge foreign policy challenge in the security area, if less so of a military one. So thanks to all three of you for those insights. I want to start this second round by just giving you a target to shoot at. Um, our scope today is broader than just defense preparedness, but at least with respect to that one issue, I'd be curious to know whether you think it would be safe to say that after 9 years, and one new defense policy and one still fairly recent update to that policy, that we have a better understanding of what we need to do to improve our capacity to intervene in the world. But we still face the very daunting challenge of actual delivery. And would it be equally safe to say that meeting that challenge is going to require a god awful large amount of money? And the only way to achieve that might be to have significant compromises in other fields of federal jurisdiction. So I'll ask you to take a look at that, but also just a more broader question of uh, what the future holds, given where we're at this moment. Kim, do you want to pick it up from there?
Sure. Thanks, Gordon. I think that to address your first question, and that is, where are we in defense preparedness? I think that one of the real difficulties is that ordinary Canadians must have a sense of uh, where we are in defense preparedness, in the sense that there is increasing willingness on the part of Canadians to think about an expanded defense area of spending. The problem is that we don't have either a government or an opposition that has tried in any way to try and explain to Canadians what we spend these billions of dollars for in defense. I mean, the two papers, the 2017 paper and the recent update, they try, but the reality is that if you're an ordinary Canadian, you might wonder what we actually spend on defense. And the difficulty is compounded when we have an opposition party and a government that is deeply, deeply resistant to doing anything serious about increasing defense spending. The Conservative Party of Canada is campaigning very much on a limited spending for government, and where they're going to find the added monies that, as you correctly point out, are going to be needed. I mean, we're talking about a president in Washington who's now coming in and saying that allies and friends of the United States need to be spending 5% on of their GDP on defense. Canada can't even get to 2% before the 2030s. And so it seems to me that the serious difficulty facing any Canadian government in 2025 is going to be dealing with the issue of defense, how to explain to Canadians why so much more is needed, and to explain to them why the trade-offs, Gordon, that you mention in other federal spending are going to be warranted. And Canadians may well ask, well, explain to me why I should give up on this in order simply to meet a particular plucked out of the air financial target.
Well, thank you for that. And I think you're quite right to flag the fact that sometimes we take a lot for granted, and both government and opposition could do a lot better job of explaining what our defense expenditures are used for. I was noticing just last week a story in the press that noted that HMCS Margaret Brooks was on its way to Antarctica, and I wondered just how that would look as a necessary, how that would be explained as a necessary expenditure of public funds, and I'm sure we could find a few other examples along that line. Kerry, did you have thoughts about the way ahead?
Oh, I always have thoughts about the way ahead. So, chief kind of challenges going forward. Well, Trump, obviously. It's funny that, a lot of the commentators are talking about Trump's approach to America first, and America will be more isolationist. I wouldn't count on that. Trump likes winning. And we've already seen him muse about intervening in some international issues in a way that is unpredictable, but certainly isn't isolationist. But what it is it's going in a direction where Canada can't methodically decide where it will align itself with US policy and where it will not. We're going to have to be much more agile. And we're going to do something that I call improve our strategic sovereignty, be much more methodical as Canadians in defining what our Canadian interests are and who the international partners are who can help us not only promote those interests, but offset the US if they start to do something that goes in a direction that's damaging to Canada. And I think they risk doing that in a number of areas. So let me focus on one area in particular, multilateralism. Um, there was a theology under the Harper government that appeared to me to be rejecting multilateralism because of defects in the system, where, for instance, bad guy states could be elected to the Human Rights Council, that kind of thing, inefficiencies, etc. And so the choice then was to take a run at the UN in rhetoric, and then initiatives that the government did put forward on the international front were largely outside the UN and largely outside of NATO. I don't think that makes sense if we're looking to Canada doesn't fare well in a world where we don't have structures that build in friends and allies, particularly friends and allies that can offset the influence of the US. So we need to search for those tables. Those tables, you mentioned Five Eyes Court. I think G7 would also be something interesting. Those are tables where the US is front and center, absolutely key. But they're also tables where we can seek friends and allies who might temper the more extremes of US policy positions. And I wouldn't discount the UN there, but I'll focus on NATO. I think it would be unwise to assume that NATO will continue to serve Canadian interests, particularly with President-elect Trump's musings about what the alliance does and doesn't bring to the US. But I think we need to take a very, very strategic approach to NATO and do a few things. We have to increase our defense spending. It was a self-own, honestly, at the Washington summit. We should have had a clean announcement that we would meet 2% much earlier than we promised to do so, done at the beginning of the summit without a lot of that back and forth, and then excuse the language, a half-assed announcement towards the end of the summit made no sense. That was one of those diplomatic failures, I call it. So we need to buy that credibility. Yes, it's a figure plucked out of the air. And yes, NATO will go at least to 3% sooner rather than later before we've even reached the 2%. And it's not in our interest to be that isolated. Two, we need to engage Canadians. I actually think the government did a really good job on Strong, Secure, Engaged of reaching out across the country in a conversation about defense spending. But unless Canadians see the security threats that they're facing in their everyday lives, which aren't just about defense, they're about a broader definition of security. I don't think you're going to get the support, any government would get the support for such a massive increase in spending. But the fact is, the security environment has shifted radically, and the security literacy of Canadians hasn't kept up. So I'm actually proposing that we should have a broader foreign policy review that is mostly about engaging Canadians in the shifts in the world, which were mostly negative in terms of security. So Canadians understand the impact on our trade, the impact on our health, the impact on our economic stability and supply chains if conflicts, and it's not just full-scale wars, but breaks in supply chains by ships, by undersea sabotage, information cables getting sabotaged, that kind of thing. So we need a broader discussion around security with Canadians so they understand how much they stand to lose if we don't increase our defense spending. But at the same time, we have to also reach out to other members, other allies within NATO to understand that we need common cause with them, not just to offset the US, but to respond to our interests. That's how I started. So Arctic, for instance, we should create an Arctic pillar inside NATO with the other Arctic states and start to talk about treating the Arctic as almost an interoperable zone between the North American Arctic and European Arctic. At the same time, invest more in NORAD. It's kind of like a push me, pull you for us to manage the US, build up our friendships with other allies to offset the US, at the same time, do what we can to please the US because, like it or not, they're our biggest neighbor to the south and they can do us a heck of a lot of damage. I'll stop there. I have other big thoughts, but I think I've gone on long enough.
Thanks for that, Kerry. You're quite right to remind us that despite a defense policy review and then an update a few years later, it does seem that we are getting to the end of Prime Minister Trudeau's decade without having had uh, any kind of foreign policy review. In fact, in 10 years, I don't think we will have had even one comprehensive statement of Canadian foreign policy. And inevitably, it's difficult to make defense and security policy when you don't have that context within which to operate. In fact, indeed, if it hadn't been for the Indo-Pacific strategy fairly late in the government's tenure, we might have had an entire decade in which foreign policy was being made transactionally at all times and never having had it made deliberatively at all. Certainly a useful reminder there. Xavier, did you have thoughts?
I did, and I agree wholeheartedly with both experts who just came before me. Although I'll speak to a specific point that Ambassador Buck made. I was back in the holidays in Vancouver over the past few weeks, and I was talking to a friend. Same background. He's very well educated, understands the world quite well. But he asked me, he was straight faced, completely serious. Why does Canada need to invest in defense when we have the United States who could come in and help us? Why can't we use that money to invest in other things? I think that the government currently does and has for the past few decades faces a legitimate problem where Canadians do not understand the value of defense spending and how it's interconnected to Canada's place in the world, how it's interconnected to our economy. I mean, folks are concerned about how to put food on the table and how to protect their loved ones. They don't see how these issues reach from the highest levels of international governments to the very local, to their own households. I think that's a communications failure on the part of government. I think we've leaned very heavily on the United States as a justification for why we need to spend 2% on defense. And to Dr. Nossal's point, instead of saying, well, we should spend 2% because the United States wants us to, and because we need to be a reliable ally, we should instead be saying we need to spend 2% on defense because the global security situation and where Canada finds itself today necessitates that kind of spending. We always need to connect budgetary and spending issues to the daily lives of Canadians. Otherwise, governments are going to have a hell of a hard time, pardon the language, freeing up the money to be able to spend on those items. Where we go from here, I know I said that we can't rely on the US as a crutch, but I think we'd be remiss not to mention that Donald Trump, the president elect here in the States, who may be inaugurated by the time this podcast comes out, has said that he wants to raise the defense spending target from 2% to 5%. If Canada's having a hard time hitting 2%, we'll have a very hard time hitting 5%. And if we can't justify to the Canadian people 2%, it's going to be an even larger leap to hit a 5% justification. So those are enduring challenges. On the idea of the foreign policy review, I think it's great. I'd go a step further and say we should be like the United States and do a national security review that explicitly ties trends in the global security system to developments happening at home and Canada's readiness to tackle those developments. It doesn't just have to be defense. It can also touch on economic security, investment screening, energy security, all these other tangential issues that do play into the security of everyday Canadians' lives.
It is strange that somehow Canadians can regularly see their armed forces, out fighting forest fires or stacking, sandbags in floods or cleaning up after hurricanes or performing search and rescue efforts or even, providing assistance to law enforcement, and that they can see all of that happening while simultaneously, as we record this, watching fires ravaging the state of California, and not consider that maybe we need to invest in the basic, national defense infrastructure that's required to do all of those things. So there's a challenge there, and maybe that gets back to the point that Kim made earlier about neither the government or the opposition doing a lot to help Canadians understand why we have to spend the money and how we're spending the money on defense that we're spending to date. So with that, let me thank all of you for your participation today. I think really appreciated your contributions. I think we've been able to do this in a fairly efficient and pointed manner. So I hope that it's of value to our listeners. And on behalf of the CDAI, I look forward to having further opportunities to talk to you about this stuff in the future. Maybe 10 years from now, we'll get together and we'll have a review on the next government's tenure.
That's all for today's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a review, send us an email at josh@CDA Institute, or reach out to us on social media. Your feedback helps us bring you content that's relevant and engaging. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Until next time, thanks.